Bruce Lee took on a group of martial arts legends. 14 seconds later, history was made without cameras. There were no cameras in the room when it happened, only senior practitioners, closed doors, and a challenge spoken too confidently. 14 seconds after they began, no one asked for a second round. No one argued about rules. Years later, the witnesses still agreed on only one detail. The man they doubted never appeared to be in a hurry, and never seemed to use force the way they understood it. The hall was narrow and low-ceilinged, lit by a single row of hanging lamps whose glow barely reached the far corners. Outside, the evening had settled into quiet. Inside, the air felt heavier, but not with tension. It carried the weight of years of practice, of measured steps and silent observation. The wooden floor, worn smooth by decades of training, seemed to remember every strike, every pivot, every stance that had ever been tried upon it. Only a handful of men were present. Some were senior masters of long-established styles, their robes and belts precise, their postures habitual and exact. Others were witnesses, invited not for authority, but for their eyes, those trained to see movement, timing, and intent. No one spoke unless necessary, and when they did, it was in low tones, measured. Every sound seemed to echo slightly in the hall, emphasizing the stillness that filled the spaces between words. Bruce Lee entered without ceremony. He did not glance around, did not acknowledge anyone beyond a brief nod. His presence did not demand attention, but it naturally drew it. Those present had heard stories, whispers of his speed, of his unconventional methods, of his ability to unsettle even the most confident practitioners. Yet no one could truly know what it meant until the moment arrived. There were no cameras, no audience, no applause, only the weight of expectation silently accumulated. A senior master finally broke the quiet, his voice steady, stating the challenge with clarity, each word deliberate. It was not about proving who could win a fight. It was about authority, whose understanding of martial arts would hold when confronted with the unknown. Bruce's reply was minimal, almost imperceptible. A nod, a slight adjustment of his stance. Nothing else. And then the room waited. Seconds stretched, measured in the calm awareness of all who knew how quickly moments could change. Every observer knew the ritual. Once the demonstration began, nothing would be rushed, and yet every heartbeat mattered. The hall contained decades of skill, reputation, and discipline, all poised to meet the unforeseen. Outside, night deepened. Inside, the silence thickened, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, knowing they were about to witness something that would be recalled in quiet conversations for years to come. The challenge was subtle but deliberate. It did not come as a shout or a grand gesture, but as a carefully worded question of legitimacy. Bruce Lee had been building his reputation quietly, moving from gym to gym, showing a style that did not follow tradition, yet demonstrated results that could not be denied. To those who had spent decades immersed in lineage, ritual, and protocol, his methods seemed abrupt, almost disrespectful. The senior master who spoke framed the confrontation not as a fight, but as a test of authority. "We recognize skill," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "But can mastery exist without adherence?" It was a question meant to provoke thought, to provoke a response, yet also to unsettle. In this room, authority was not claimed lightly. It was measured in years, in adherence to form, and in the subtle assertion of psychological dominance over peers. Bruce listened without argument. He did not respond with philosophy, nor with challenge. There was no attempt to impress or intimidate. His presence alone reframed the conversation. Those who had expected defensiveness or brashness noted its absence. They expected force or at least resistance. Instead, there was stillness, almost deliberate. The room, filled with men trained to project confidence, became aware that the usual markers of authority, Posture, tone, even eye contact were being quietly redefined. The observers, trained to read nuance, noticed small things. The way Bruce shifted his weight without motion, the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the calm in his eyes. There was no overt challenge, yet no concession either. The tension was subtle, psychological, a quiet assertion that mastery need not follow prescribed patterns to exist. Those present understood that the challenge was not only physical, it was a question of legitimacy, of who would define the measure of skill. A murmur ran through the room, almost imperceptible. It was not excitement, nor alarm. It was anticipation, the kind that accumulates when confidence meets uncertainty. Bruce's approach had already begun to unsettle those who had come expecting to assert dominance. His authority did not demand recognition. It revealed itself in the stillness, in the patience, in the silent readiness that seemed to defy conventional rules. The stage was set. The public questioning of tradition had been established without confrontation, without ceremony. Those present now understood. The outcome, though unseen, had already begun to take shape. Word traveled slowly, carried by whispers between schools, between students, and along quiet hallways where lineage and reputation were measured as carefully as technique. No announcement was made. No public challenge was issued. Yet everyone who mattered, senior instructors, accomplished fighters, and devoted students, knew something was unfolding behind closed doors. The anticipation was not loud. There were no banners or spectators, no crowds to cheer or jeer. Instead, it existed in the subtle shift of conversations, the careful recounting of what had been seen and what might be. Those who had trained for decades began to consider the possibility that a single individual could upend the hierarchy, not through sheer power, but through precision, insight, and quiet mastery. Among the observers, tension was measured in small gestures. A tightening of hands on staffs, the brief narrowing of eyes, the careful adjustment of posture. Experienced practitioners, who could read movement in the subtlest of motions, found themselves pausing, wondering what it might feel like to face someone whose timing, intention, and perception were as disciplined as any technique they had known. In this environment, the concept of challenge was psychological. Those who would have relied on ritual and tradition now felt the subtle pressure of the unknown. The sense of inevitability began to grow, not as threat, but as quiet certainty. Everyone understood that the outcome, though not yet visible, would not be ordinary. By the time the demonstration was set to begin, the room felt heavier. Observers recalled previous confrontations, previous tests of skill and authority, and knew how swiftly reputations could shift. Yet this was different. It was not the presence of physical threat that loomed. It was the unseen weight of mastery, concentrated in one individual, so calm that it became nearly imperceptible. The moment carried a paradoxical stillness, expectation coexisting with restraint. Each participant, each witness, knew that a brief, almost invisible interaction could redefine what they understood as skill. And as the last seconds passed before movement began, a shared awareness settled. Everyone was about to observe something they would never forget, though few could fully explain it. The moment arrived without ceremony. No drum, no signal, no sudden announcement. Only the quiet shift of bodies in anticipation. Bruce Lee stood facing the group, his posture relaxed yet precise, shoulders unweighted, hands at ease. The senior practitioners assumed their positions, confident in their years of training, their styles honed to predict, counter, and dominate. Then it began. Movement was minimal. There was no flourish, no theatrics. Observers later described it not as a fight, but as a conversation conducted entirely through intention and timing. Bruce did not strike indiscriminately. He did not overwhelm with force. Instead, every action was deliberate, an efficient reading of balance, rhythm, and human expectation. In 14 seconds, every practitioner had been engaged, every approach tested, every instinct probed, and none could find a foothold. Some moved, some hesitated, some adjusted mid-step, yet each reaction was anticipated and neutralized with economy. It was not speed alone, though his hands and feet moved faster than the eye could comfortably follow. It was clarity. Clarity of perception, clarity of purpose, clarity of outcome. Those who had expected confrontation noted a curious absence. There was no anger, no aggression. There was no struggle in the conventional sense. And yet, by the end, the room had shifted. Confidence had subtly eroded, replaced by quiet reevaluation. The senior masters, each trained to assert authority physically and psychologically, realized they had been tested in a way that left no room for debate. Some tried to describe what had happened. They spoke of movements that seemed to arrive before intention, of positions that shifted without effort, and of balance so precise it seemed almost preemptive. But the description could never fully capture it. It existed in the experience itself, in the fleeting recognition of control exercised without apparent force. When the 14 seconds ended, Bruce did not move to claim victory. He did not glance around. He simply returned to his original stance. Silence followed. Not the silence of shock or amazement, but the measured silence of acknowledgement, of an event that had already cemented itself in memory. No applause, no celebration, only the quiet awareness that what had occurred could not be undone, only studied and respected. The observers, men who had spent lifetimes asserting skill, were left with the stark realization. Mastery did not always announce itself. Sometimes it revealed itself in the absence of struggle. The 14 seconds had ended, but the room remained still. There was no rush to speak, no urgent reassessment allowed, only measured breathing, subtle shifts of weight, and the occasional glance toward the floor. The challengers, each accustomed to commanding authority through presence and technique, found their certainty quietly unsettled. It was not injury that had humbled them. There were no bruises, no visible marks. The lesson lay entirely in perception, in the recognition that their responses, their timing, and even their instinctive movements had been anticipated, neutralized, and rendered almost irrelevant. The realization arrived slowly, like the gradual settling of dust after a storm. They had not failed because they were weak, but because they had not accounted for mastery expressed through understanding rather than force. Observers later recounted subtle signs of the psychological shift. The way shoulders sagged slightly, the way eyes that had carried unwavering confidence now flicked toward Bruce for reassurance, the way hands loosened on staffs and weapons. Each gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they spoke of a quiet concession. Not surrender in words, but an acknowledgement that the parameters of authority had been redefined in a fraction of a moment. No one spoke of victory or defeat. There was only the quiet realignment of perception. Those present understood that what had transpired was not a contest in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration, an unspoken lesson on efficiency, timing, and the subtle art of control. Every practitioner left with a lingering question. How could skill be so absolute, yet so restrained? The air itself seemed to have shifted. Conversations were delayed, hesitant, cautious. Those accustomed to dictating the flow of training or asserting dominance in public began to reassess the assumptions they had carried for decades. They were not humiliated, at least not in the conventional sense, but they were reminded that mastery could exist outside the boundaries they had always trusted. And Bruce Lee, silent and steady, did not celebrate. He returned to his own preparation, to the calm rhythm of his own breathing. There was no need to assert triumph. It had been quietly established irrevocably, through precision and observation rather than spectacle. Years later, the story circulated quietly, passed from student to student, teacher to teacher. Details varied. The exact movements, the specific responses, but the essence remained. In a room without cameras, without applause, Bruce Lee had demonstrated a level of mastery that defied conventional expectation. It became a touchstone, not of victory, but of understanding. Those who had been present rarely spoke in public about the event. When they did, it was in measured tones, almost as if speaking too loudly might distort the memory. They described how the lesson lingered long after the hall had emptied, in training habits, in reassessments of technique, in the subtle humility that emerged among even the most accomplished practitioners. It was a reminder that authority could be challenged, and that true skill did not announce itself through force. The impact unfolded slowly. Students who had witnessed Bruce's demonstration began to adjust their own approach to training, not in haste, not in imitation, but through quiet observation. They learned to value precision over volume, timing over aggression, anticipation over reaction. The hallways of schools across the region carried an invisible echo. Mastery was as much psychological as physical, a dialogue between perception and control rather than a contest of strength. In private conversations, years later, senior masters would sometimes reflect on the room itself, the narrow hall, the worn floor, the subtle shifts of balance that had gone unnoticed by all but the most trained eyes. They recalled not just the technique, but the presence. Calm, controlled, unassuming, yet absolute. What had occurred in those 14 seconds became less about the moment and more about what it taught, over time, about the nature of skill. The legend endured because it could not be captured in spectacle. It existed in memory, in habit, in the quiet recalibration of understanding. Bruce Lee's demonstration left no trophies, no headlines, no footage, only witnesses, and through them, a subtle revolution in how mastery was perceived and pursued. In the end, the room was empty, the lamps dimmed, yet the lessons survived. The demonstration had been brief, almost imperceptible, but its influence extended across years, shaping students, guiding instructors, and quietly challenging assumptions about what it meant to be a martial artist. And so, history remembered it not for the sound of fists or the speed of movement, but for the silence that followed. A silence heavy with understanding, quiet authority, and a standard of mastery that required no audience to be complete.